Welcome, Claire. I'm so happy and honored to have you on my podcast. How are you today?
I'm great, Conny. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about boundaries, as you know. So yeah, it's really exciting to be here. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. So before we dive into these boundaries, tell us a little bit, who is Claire aside from boundaries and where in the world are you?
So I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm a coach. I'm a teacher, a yoga and meditation teacher. I'm a speaker. I love speaking about this topic. And I'm the founder of Better Boundaries and another program I'm working on called The Self-Centered Woman. And basically, I work with people to help them deepen the connection they have with themselves. So I help my clients find their voice. I help them find their no and set boundaries in their lives so they can show up fully as they are in the world without losing themselves in their relationships, because ultimately the most important relationship we have is the one with ourselves, and it's really my role to help people nurture that relationship.
Yeah, and I know because you told me, and I also read it on your website, that you're originally from England, but we don't necessarily hear that, so you're doing a really good job to sound like from Australia.
Yeah, I've been here a long time now. I've been here 18 years. So yeah, long time. But it's funny, when I go back home to England, my English accent comes back. And then if I'm in Wales, because I lived in Wales for about 7 years, my Welsh accent starts to come through. And they all tell me I sound really Australian. But in Australia, people tell me that I still sound English. So it's funny how these things work.
Yeah, I know that a little bit. So I live in Canada, but when I was growing up in Switzerland, I grew up near Zurich, but where I was living, that was a different dialect. And so people in Zurich would tell me I sound like somebody from Aargau, and in Aargau, they would tell me, oh, you're sounding like from Zurich. So it's kind of like, that's how I imagine it.
Yes.
Yeah. And so a little fun fact also, maybe first about you. I saw on your website too that you sometimes binge watch Netflix. So I wanted to know, what's your favorite show on Netflix?
Oh, okay. What have I been watching lately? I have been watching Virgin River.
Oh, yeah, I watched that too.
Yeah, it's really cute. It's quite soapy. But I can't watch violence anymore. I can't do it. I can't watch people being mean to each other anymore. So I tend to, if I watch things, they tend to be quite gentle in nature. And Virgin River, I love the sense of community that they have. The scenery is just spectacular. And it's just a really kind, gentle show to watch. And there's, plenty of drama.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt that he's pretty good looking too.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that definitely helps. And there's a strong female lead, which I also like.
Yes. So so I watched it too. I actually binge watched that one, which I usually don't do. I'm not a binge watcher. I usually watch 1 or 2 episodes and then I can turn off and watch, continue watching another time. But the newest season that came out, I literally binge watched in one night. So this is very unheard of in Connie's world. Yeah, I watched from 10 at night till 6 in the morning.
Oh, wow. That's a good effort. That's commitment.
Yeah, and no boundaries. So let's talk about boundaries. But first, before we go deeper, let's define boundaries. So how do you define boundaries? Because I feel like sometimes people may have a little bit trouble, and I was one of them. I know now how I would define it, but I want to hear how you define it.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people think boundaries are walls. They're not walls. They're sort of, I describe them as energetic dividing lines. So just like a house might have a fence around it and it has a gate so people can come in and out. That's how I think of sort of boundaries. So they're an energetic dividing line that help us determine what's you and what's me. And we can have boundaries in terms of our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being, our sexual well-being. We can have boundaries in all areas of our lives. And it's about determining, boundaries help us know who we are and who we're not, and what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate. So they're semi-permeable. We get to decide what we let in and what we keep out.
Mm-hmm. But now, of course, oftentimes people have no boundaries because they're people pleasers, or they never learn to say no, or they are scared to say no. So how do we know what our boundaries are? Like, because we may have never thought of it that way, you know? So
yeah, and that was my experience. I was definitely a people pleaser. And I think I didn't like to say no. I said yes to things I didn't want to do. And I think there's a few things we can learn about our own boundaries, and we can learn what our boundaries are. And it can be around our feelings. So I've done a lot of, as a yoga teacher, I've done a lot of yoga over the years. So I've got very in touch with my body and what my body's telling me. So if someone says to me, you know, do you want to go out next Saturday? If my instincts tell me no, then I honor that. So it's partly about tuning in and going, what is really going on for me in this moment? And then there's an inquiry about, well, why do I feel I need to say yes when my instincts or my body or my heart is telling me no? So it's about tuning into the body. And it's also about recognizing what's going on for us. So if there's anger, if there's resentment, if there's burnout, all of which I have suffered, which is why I'm so passionate about boundaries. If those things are going on, there's a sign that we've violated our own boundary, or someone else has violated a boundary. And it's usually us, because, you know, I'm sure we'll dive into this, we can't change anyone else's behavior. So we have to determine what we will and won't tolerate. So yes, to answer your question, it's getting in touch with our feelings and really learning the signals from our body, and looking at how we're feeling in our lives, looking at, you know, is there anger, is there burnout, is there exhaustion, is there resentment? They're all signs that we need better boundaries in our lives.
Now, one would think that we're probably born with being in contact or acknowledging our feelings. But I don't know how it was for you growing up in England, but for me growing up in Switzerland, of course, you're called a good girl if you're saying yes, and if you're people pleasing, and if you're doing what people asking you and saying no. I don't want to say anything bad about anybody, but it's kind of like saying no was almost considered rude when I was growing up, especially as a little girl. So how do we even like overcome this kind of fear of saying no, or feeling guilty of saying no, because we were kind of told growing up that saying yes and being helpful and the running around and helping everybody but us is being the good girl. And I feel like sometimes still the message is like, if you can handle everything, especially as a woman, and you can look after, she looks after everybody else first before her, is still kind of like this thing. And so how do we move away from this guilt and this anxiety or being scared of saying no, or honoring what we're feeling? That was a long question, sorry.
No, it's such a great question, Conny. And I imagine that so many people watching and listening to this will relate to what you've just shared, because that was certainly my experience. And I think it's very much a cultural narrative in, you know, especially around women. And that's why I think a lot of my clients are women. You know, we're raised to be nice girls, to be polite, and, you know, especially in Britain, you know, we're terribly polite in Britain. And, you know, if Auntie Mavis wanted to hug you and you didn't want to be hugged, then, you know, that was rude and that would upset Auntie Mavis, right? So we kind of grow up with this idea that we are responsible for how other people feel, and we're not. And it's kind of, I think it's something that we're slowly starting to wake up to, because we don't have that power. You know, we're so powerful in many ways as humans, but we ultimately are responsible as adults, especially. We are responsible for our own feelings, our own well-being, and we are not responsible for how others feel. I follow a psychologist called Dr. Henry Cloud. He's written a book on boundaries. I highly recommend it. He's fabulous. And he talks about being responsible to, not responsible for. And there's a difference, especially, you know, in our close relationships. So I think, yes, there's very much a cultural narrative in different parts of the world, perhaps most of the world, that, you know, women are meant to be nice and do all the things. And, you know, it's funny, you made that comment about, you know, we put these women that can do everything on pedestals, and, you know, we say, oh, she's amazing. And someone once called me Superwoman. And it horrified me, because I thought, I am not Superwoman. I am living with exhaustion and resentment and anger. And I was doing all these things that I thought I had to do and who I should be to be perfect. And all the time I was completely abandoning myself.
Yeah.
So to answer your question about how we overcome the guilt, it takes practice. It takes practice. And that's why I do coaching in this space, because I think, it takes support. I had to get a lot of support in learning to set my own boundaries, because it's very confusing as well, I find it initially, because, you know, we've got all these kind of feelings going on. And what I had to learn to do was lean into the discomfort, because we have a choice, right? We can live with the resentment of doing what we don't want to do and resenting the other person that we're in a relationship with. And the resentment over time will destroy us, and it will destroy the relationship.
Yeah.
Or we can lean into the guilt, which is temporary. And then that will help us enhance our relationships, because we're not living with this resentment and anger towards the other person, which is actually misplaced, because it's not their fault that we're not honoring ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you mentioned something that is so common also, or was, I don't know how it is now, but was so common also in Switzerland when I grew up. Like you said, Auntie, whatever her name is, comes, Rose or Rosa or whatever. And as a child, you're supposed to hug her or maybe even kiss her. And even you don't want to do it. And I feel like, I mean, it can go all the way to us not having the proper boundaries when we're adults and a man comes and asks something from us that we don't want to do, or any other person. So I'm not like trying to make anybody wrong, but I mean, because we are then maybe not clear. No, I mean, it can have really hard consequences if we're not clear. And and also because it is, like you said, so many emotions come up, and I have said that on this podcast before, we're not used to dealing with emotions, because most likely we also didn't grow up learning about, I didn't grow up learning how to deal with emotions. We were more or less told either don't feel them or you know, or just toughen up or whatever. And it's in one way I always say, like, it's so sad that we have to learn these things, and on the other hand, it's so good that we're now having the awareness and we're having people like you that can help us. And to learn this, and to learn how we move beyond the guilt or that confusion, to want to listen to us. And my coach, for example, Brooke Castillo from the Life Coach School, she always says, like, if you're a people pleaser, you're basically a liar. And then you make the other person responsible for your lies, because you get, like you said, you get resentful. And this is the stupid thing that happens when we're not taking care of it.
Yeah. And we're just continuously abandoning ourselves. But if we were raised in a culture or in an environment where that's kind of what you did, then we don't know any different. And I had the same experience, and I talk about this on my website, how in my 30s I was sort of going, how am I only just now learning to deal with my emotions? And that was through my yoga teacher training, through my meditation training, through learning to allow my experience to be there. And this is mindfulness, allowing my experience to be there without judgment. And that's why I pair the two, the coaching and the mindfulness and the body awareness and the body sensing, because, a big part of being able to claim who we are starts with being connected to ourselves and connected to our bodies, where our messengers are. But, when we're children, if we're taught, don't speak, don't hear, don't see what's going on, be polite, be nice, it's gaslighting. And then what we continue to do as we get older is we just keep gaslighting ourselves. Oh, I shouldn't feel that. I shouldn't think that. I shouldn't say that. And for me, what it's about is learning to be more authentic with myself. And, what's really going on for me here? What am I feeling? I'm feeling anger. Okay, well, let's kind of, let's sit with this anger. Let's allow it to be there. Let's feel it. Let's acknowledge it. Because, that's another thing that we're told as women, anger is not attractive. We're not allowed to be angry. Well, of course we are. We're humans. We have anger. Anger is an important messenger. It tells us that a boundary has been violated, that some injustice has occurred somewhere, and we need to take action. That's all our emotions are, is they're messengers. But yes, we have this kind of, and honestly, I think it's across the world. And I think as you suggested, we're starting to wake up to this, that, these messages that we give children aren't helpful, because we teach them to stay quiet. And we can allow our children to have their experience just like we can with our friends. We can allow them to have their experience, but still set a boundary. We can do that with children. We can do that as adults with the other relationships in our lives. I'm sorry you're upset, but I'm still setting this boundary, and that might be something that is said internally. But again, not letting other people's reactions to us change our behavior.
Yeah. And so, like my podcast here, we talk a lot about clutter, and I just want to quickly, for the listener, close the circle, how this shows up with clutter. So it shows up in your calendar with a cluttered calendar, way too overcommitted, doing everything, saying yes to everything. So you're basically having what I call social clutter. But it can also result in physical clutter, because somebody may come and give you, I got this, and you can have it, and you don't want it, but you're taking it because you don't dare to say, no, I don't want this item. Or and Violet gives you a vase for your wedding or whatever, and 20 years later you still have this ugly vase, or maybe it's not ugly, but you don't like it, and you still have it because you would feel guilty to give it away. And so you're basically putting Aunt Violet's feeling about that gift that she may have forgotten already over what you're feeling. And so this is where it creates a lot of clutter in your home, in the physical space. It creates clutter in yourself, emotional clutter, because every time you see the vase, you're probably like, oh, I don't like that vase. And then because you're conditioned that way, you're not allowed to express your feelings. So just wanted to quickly close the loop for people who would think like, okay, what do these boundaries have to do now with physical clutter or any clutter in general? But that's exactly what happens.
Yeah. And our environment, it can be our physical environment, our emotional environment becomes about what other people want rather than what we want. And I want to say here that it is not selfish to take care of yourself. It's not selfish to want what you want. It's not selfish to be who you are. It's not selfish to say no. It is actually your responsibility. We're not responsible for other people, and we don't want to make other people responsible for us. You know, often in relationships, especially where there might not be clear communication or boundaries, you might get someone who says, but they should know how I feel. They should know what I want. I shouldn't have to tell them. Well, I don't agree with that. You know, we're not mind readers, and people are often so caught up in their own reality and their own heads and their own stuff. I think clear communication is so much better. But if we've been raised as a people pleaser, if we've been raised to not communicate clearly, then when we do start to communicate clearly, it can feel really aggressive. It can feel really aggressive, but it's not aggressive. It's just assertive.
Yeah. Or maybe because we are not, so I speak from my own experience. So when I started to actually come out of people pleasing and saying no, maybe sometimes it did come out in a way aggressive. And why? Because I was so tense inside that I had to say no, that I actually put it too strong across, because I wanted to brace myself already for whatever recoil that was coming. No, and then it could turn out aggressive, even though you may not mean it that way, but you're so tense and so scared that because we haven't learned it. No, like when I grew up, like I heard sometimes, oh, you made mommy really sad or something. It's like we get this message that if we're saying what we want or what we don't want, God forbid, then we're making the other person sad. So then when we start listening to us, we may come across too strong in the beginning because we don't have that fine-tuning yet how to say it in a loving way, because you can say it in a loving way, but we may not practice enough, or we may not know now or yet.
Yeah. And I think it's important to, one of the things I coach people on is to start small and allow yourselves to make mistakes, allow yourselves to be clumsy, because it's, you know, it's like I don't know, it's like when you're learning to ride a bike and you're on your training wheels, you know, it's a new skill that we're developing. So I encourage people to kind of start small and start with themselves and some of their own behavior before they start communicating to others about some of those bigger boundary conversations. And the other thing I say to people is to use I statements, because a lot of people tend to focus on what the other person is doing, and it's about bringing the communication in-house and saying, you know, this is what I want, this is what I need, rather than you're doing this, you're doing that. Then it puts the focus on the other person. But boundaries are about our own behavior, not what other people are doing. And that's something that it took me a long time to grasp, and it's something I know my clients sometimes struggle with. They'll want to say you, and I'm like, no, bring it back to I statements, because then it's not attacking, blaming, shaming the other person.
Yeah. And I think these you statements also come from us like being too nervous or too out of touch or too feeling guilty, and then we're like, we're just coming across too strong. And at least that's how it was for me, because we were not taught how to do it properly, because we were kind of taught that we're not supposed to say no, we're not supposed to put ourselves or our self-care higher, or at least even at the same level like somebody else, you know.
And that's all we're doing with boundaries, is we are putting ourselves on an equal footing with others. It's not putting others above us, it's not putting others below us, it's not about trying to control other people. It's just about treating ourselves with the same love and respect that we treat other people. That's all it is.
So when I help people declutter, I always say like start, like you just said too, start small. And I always say like start somewhere where it's not so emotionally charged. So I could imagine it's similar with setting boundaries. No, you're not starting with maybe Aunt Violet or somebody who you start maybe with something at the grocery store, or how do you suggest that people start small, like in what area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to use your example of the grocery store because I think it's great. And I'm going to give an example from my own experience. where I used to, this is years ago now, I used to go to a market here in Melbourne, and I would go and buy my fish from the market. And they would always give me a piece of fish that was huge, and it was too big for one person. So what I learned to do, and this was terrifying for me, what I learned to do was say, I'd like that piece of fish there, please, the smaller one. So it's just a tiny little way of asking for our needs to be met. And I remember having this conversation with a therapist years ago where I was living with someone, I was sharing a house with someone, and she didn't empty the bin as much as I would like. It seemed to kind of fall to me all the time to empty the bin. And I was sat in my therapist's office complaining that my housemate wouldn't empty the bin. And he said, oh, I'd like you to say to her, I would like you to empty the bin. I was horrified. I was like, I can't say that. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I can't ask for that. I can't say I would like, it was such an alien thing for me to say. So what I encourage some people to do is just to walk around their house saying, I want, I would like, I need, and to get used to saying that in their own home at first before they start saying it to other people, and get used to how it feels in their body, because initially there can be some real resistance. It can be really hard to say, I want, I need, I would like, this is what I want from you, this is what I expect. And these are all assertive statements. They're not aggressive statements. So even just kind of doing it in the privacy of your own home is a great little way to start. And interactions where there's no, like you say, there's no kind of emotional charge with people at the grocery store or, the post office, wherever it might be, just starting small.
Yeah, or even going to Starbucks or whatever coffee shop and asking for maybe different topic or a topping, not topic, topping or something that is a little bit out of the norm instead of so that's kind of I like that example with walking around and saying I want this, or I'd like to have this in your home without anybody there. Practicing.
Another way you can practice is in traffic. So I had a friend years ago that shared with me that she I don't know if you have the same over in Canada, but when you're driving along and you're sat at traffic lights, sometimes there's a green arrow that allows you to go off to the left or the right while you're sitting in traffic. And sometimes that's not an assigned lane. So sometimes people who are sitting in that lane might not be wanting to turn left or right, but the person behind them might want to. So my friend was telling me how she would turn left or right when she was in that lane if someone behind her wanted to turn, because she didn't want to block their way. So, that's another example of over responsibility for other people's feelings. So the other thing I encourage people to do is to notice those little things and start to sit with the discomfort. So sitting there knowing that someone around you is getting agitated, or might be in your mind, they might not, but in your mind you're worried they're getting agitated and you want to change your behavior to make life easier for the other person. What I encourage people to do is to sit with that discomfort and just go, okay, this is really uncomfortable. Where do I feel it? What's my impulse right now? Can I breathe into this impulse? Can I sit with it? So that's another thing I encourage people to do.
I love these examples with strangers, because it might be easier to start with strangers than with people we know, because we don't necessarily have to see them again. So even if maybe you do notice how they get maybe aggravated, or when you go and buy fish and you say I want to have this piece, the person could maybe be a little bit annoyed because they already pulled out a different piece, but it's nothing bad. So I love these examples. So when people tell us a little bit how people can work with you around these boundaries, how do you work with them one-on-one, or how does it work?
So I work with people either one-on-one or in group coaching. So later in September, I've got an 8-week online course starting called Better Boundaries. And we look at what boundaries are, what they're not, what happened to our boundaries, how to move through those uncomfortable feelings. We look at, I teach skills and I give scripts on how to have boundary conversations. We look at boundaries in different areas of your life. We look at boundaries with ourselves, boundaries with others, and how to have some of those difficult conversations. So that's an 8-week online course, and there's live sessions with me. There's practice sessions as well. So that starts on September 26th. So that's one way to work with me. That will be the only course that runs this year. I will do it again next year at some stage. The other way is people can have one-on-one sessions with me. So if people are a bit uncomfortable in terms of a group, they can work one-on-one, and we can look at the different areas of their lives where they're struggling with boundaries. A lot of people, for example, I know especially at the moment with the pandemic and lockdown here in Australia, we've been in lockdown for, I know in Victoria especially, we've been in lockdown for over 200 days on and off. And people are really struggling with boundaries at work. So I often work with people around developing boundaries at work, because you can have boundaries at work and you can have boundaries with your boss, and that is sometimes news to people. So I work with and coach people on communicating, identifying, clarifying and communicating some of those boundaries and moving through some of those emotions. So we might dive into physical sensations in the body and helping them to sit more comfortably with some of those feelings. So yeah, it's just either one-on-one, group, and learning these life skills that really we should have learned, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Should have learned growing up.
Yeah.
Instead of learning all kinds of stuff that we may not need anymore in the future, we could have learned that. But I don't know, maybe these Montessori schools, you learn it there, but in the regular school I went to, I sure didn't learn anything. On the contrary, you more learned like, don't get angry, don't show up, don't say no, ask for permission for everything and anything.
Yeah, children should be seen and not heard, and sit quietly, do as you're told, all these really unhelpful messages. That we then, that they sort of, we adopt those into our consciousness, and then we take them into adult life, and then we wonder why our adult lives and relationships aren't working. So then we have to kind of dive back in and unpack all these unhelpful beliefs and this unhelpful conditioning that is can have a really negative impact in our lives, and then we can learn better ways of being in the world, and healthier ways, and start to give ourselves permission.
I call that all mental and emotional clutter that has to then be worked through and decluttered and let go. And that's some of the, like, if you think physical clutter is difficult, like I feel like mental and emotional is very difficult clutter to work through.
Yes. Yeah. And do you think sometimes the physical clutter is a great way of sort of masking the mental and emotional clutter?
Because so it has several angles. So the angle when you don't know how to deal with your emotions, you may go out and buy something just to kind of soothe yourself, or to suppress whatever bad in brackets feeling you had. Or it, like I mentioned earlier, you may not say no when somebody wants to give you something, or like if one of your relatives passes on, and which is sad, but then people take on their stuff and put it in their home, and they don't even like it, but they feel like they have to, because we never learned to actually take ourselves serious. So there's lots of angles, and also on top of it, when you start to declutter, when you start letting things go, I feel like it helps with dealing with these emotional and mental clutter later. Because you can, I always say, like, as within, so without, and vice versa. So you can actually practice with physical items to become better with mental clutter and emotional clutter, and vice versa. So
it's just this process, isn't it, of letting go and stripping back all these layers of things that we have, so who we really are can come through.
Exactly. Yeah, so I will put the link to your website and all that in the show notes so people can find you if somebody's interested to maybe sign up for a one-on-one or for your program that starts later in September. Do you have any last words of, not that you haven't shared any wisdom, but any last words of wisdom, or is there anything I didn't ask or that you want my listeners to still hear before we wrap up?
I think just this idea that it's not selfish to do this work. I think we really have to get past that as a culture, that it's not selfish to take care of yourself. It's not selfish to recognize and ask for what you want and need. It's what you're here to do. You know, your purpose, all of our purpose, is to be ourselves. It's really the only way to live, and to deepen that connection to ourselves means that we can show up fully in the world as who we are and who we were meant to be. And it gives other people permission to do the same. And I think that's a really, really wonderful thing.
Yeah, I think it takes an extra layer out between our connection with other people, because when we can say what we want to say honestly, we can let the other person say honestly, and then there's this layer of people pleasing and all that is gone. So it becomes, actually, the relationships become easier and clearer and more loving, I feel. So
yeah, they do. Yeah, more intimate, you know, and we can love people for who they are, and we can allow other people to love us for who we are. Without all the enmeshment and kind of ickiness getting in the way.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thanks so much, Claire, for coming on, taking the time, talking with me for my listeners all about boundaries. I'm really honored that you took the time. Thank you.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Thank you.